Today's daf, we're going to be learning a Sanhedrin daf Daled. We're going to get started with the bottom of Gimel Amud Bet. This is the daf for Shabbat. In general, the Shabbat daf and for Chagim goes up on Erev Shabbat or Erev Chag, so you can access it early if you want and get ahead. Okay, we're going to get started with this machloket that we have between Rebbe and the rabbis about how many judges you need for dinei mamonot, for monetary law. So we had Rebbe who said 5 and the rabbis who said 3. And now we're going to see their source. I'm going to start again from the bottom of Gimel Amud Bet. And there's a study guide today, which I'm going to share screen for. I'm going to share it right now, and you'll see the study guide. Elahaynu Tamid Rebbe Asher Yoshiun Elohim Trey. So the pasuk says, okay, let's start from the beginning. Ad Elohim Yavod Val Shnehem. This is in Shemot Kaf Bet pasuk 8, pasuk Chet. Until the judges, Elohim here is judges, both sides will bring their issue to the judges, Asher Yarshi'un Elohim. And then the judges will decide who is the wicked person. But notice the word Yarshi'un. Yarshi'un is plural. So the Rebbe says, Asher Yarshi'un Elohim, Trey Ne'emar, that's 2. And then, Ne'emar, Trey, sorry, that's 2 because it's plural. Yarshi'un Elohim is plural judges. And then, so Elohim could be singular, Elohim could be plural, but the Yarshi'un is specifically plural. So, Ne'emar Elohim lamata v'ne'emar Elohim lamala. So it says Elohim at the beginning of the pasuk, and it also says at the end of the pasuk. Lamata is first at the end, where it says Yarshi'un, which we said is 2. And then it also says Elohim in the beginning of the pasuk, which could be 1 or 2, but we say ma lamata shnayim, af lamala shnayim, just like it's 2 in the second part of the pasuk, because it's next to this word Yarshi'un. It's also 2 at the beginning part of the pasuk. So you have 2 and another 2 is 4, ve'ein beitin shakul, and you can't have an even number of judges. So mosifim aleim od echad arekan chamisha. We add 1 more and we get to 8 and 5. And that's how we know 5 judges. Now comes Rabbanan. The Rabbanan, starting at the top of Daf Daled, Yarshi'an ktiv. Yarshi'un would be plural, and that's how it's read. But the rabbis say it doesn't say it with a vav, it says it without a vav. And that Yarshi'an Elohim would be literally means Yarshi'u oto, which means, right, the person, one singular, will make them into, who's good and who's bad. And therefore, it's a singular word, and therefore it's 1 and 1, and then you need to add 1 more to make it an odd number, and that would get you to 3 and not 5. And that's the basis of the machloket between them. So now comes Rabbi Yitzchak bar Yossi, or there's some gears of problems of what it should say, or Yitzchak bar Yosef. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, he says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, and that leads us to our chart. Rabbi Yehuda ben Roetz bet Shammai v'Rabbi Shimon v'Rabbi Akiva kulu svira lehu yesh aim lamikra. Period. They all hold yesh aim lamikra. Okay, let's go through what's yesh aim lamikra and yesh aim lamasoret. Aim lamikra. Aim means like the mother is the great for us women. The mother is the main thing. So there's the mother. The main thing is the mikra, is the way we read it. And yesh aim lamasoret is the way the tradition tells us it is. Now, what does it mean the tradition tells us it is? I always find these terms a little confusing because you would say maybe the tradition tells you how to read it, but no. There's how people read it, and then there's what the tradition says about how it's written. Now, how things are written in the Torah is passed down by tradition through the rabbis or through the scribes, really. And it's something that not many people know. The Rama with a hey, explains, commentary Yav Rama and Sanhedrin, explains that why is it called masoret? Because from the word masul, it was passed on to a select few people. As opposed to yesh aim lamikra, how to read it, that everybody knows how to read it. Everybody knows it's read as Yarshi'un. Nobody thinks it's Yarshi'an. So that's just lamikra, how it's read. Okay? Now we're going to see that it's not just Rebbe who hold this way, but we're going to see a bunch of machlokot about some people hold yesh aim lamikra and some people hold yesh aim lamasoret. So Rabbi Yochanan here is combining opinions and saying, by the way, I want you to see there's all these machlokot and they're all based on the same concept. Is there aim lamikra? Do we follow when it's written one way but read in a different way? Which one do we follow? So let's keep going, and you're going to see already from the chart that this one actually there's no machloket about. But all the others we're going to see, there's a machloket about them. So you can see the chart goes through all 5. So let's see. Rebbe had Amaran. So Rebbe we already saw. that he holds yesh aim lemikra, follows yer shi'un, the way it's read, plural, and from there he gets to 5 judges. Rabbi Yehuda ben Roetz, Tanya, as it says in a Braita, Sha'alu Talmidim et Rabbi Yehuda ben Roetz, Ekra ani shiv'im. Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about Vayikra, chapter 12, verse 5. Ve'im nekevat helev utme'a shiv'im shvu'ayim kenidata. Okay, now the question is how to read that word. That word is spelled shiv'im, 70. But what it's really saying is if a woman gives birth to a girl, the mother is going to be impure for 2 weeks. Shvu'ayim, not shiv'im. Now, shvu'ayim is actually missing a vav, and it's also missing a double yud there. It should have a double yud at the end, not one yud. So the word looks like shiv'im in the Torah. So he says, Ekani shiv'im, right? The Talmidim said to Rabbi Yehuda ben Roetz, should we read it as shiv'im? Yachol tehei yoledet nekevat me'ah shiv'im. Maybe she's impure for 70 days, which is definitely not the case. Amar lahen timei v'tiher b'zachal v'timei v'tiher b'nekeva. So comes Rabbi Yehuda ben Roetz and he's going to give them 2 answers. The second one is the one that interests us, but first we have to go through his first answer. He says, listen, there's tuma and tara by a woman who gives birth to a male child and by a woman who gives birth to a female child. Okay, that means that when a woman gives birth, the first 7 days, if she has a male child, first 7 days she has dam of impurity. That means any dam she sees that's impure blood and she has to separate from her husband. By Torah law, any blood she sees after that is called pure blood. For the next 33 days, she's not impure to her husband. It's a special kind of dispensation or a special kind of blood doesn't make her forbidden to her husband. However, until the 40 days elapses, the 7 and the 33, she can't go to the temple until those 40 days are over. At the end of those 40 days, she brings a sacrifice, and with that, she's permitted to eat sacrificial meat. So there's Tuma and Tara by the male, and it's 7 days and 33 days. And Timei v'tiher b'nekeva, and there's Tuma days and Tahor days for a woman who gives birth to a female also. So again, what's that? Well, it's either 14 or 70. And the other days are 66. Now, if you look, what do you see here? Ma kishetihel b'zachal b'nekeva kiflayim. Well, if there's 33 days of pure blood and 66, right, for giving birth to a male, and 66 for giving birth to a female, we have to assume av kishetime b'zachal b'nekeva kiflayim. Also, when they make the male impure, we're going to assume the female is double the amount. So, therefore, if it's 7 for the boy, we'll assume 14 for the girl. And that's his answer. How do we know it's not shiv'im, but it's shvu'ayim? Because of that. However, la'achar sheyetzu, now this happens a lot. It happens to me after I finish teaching and I realize, oh, I have a better answer for that. So, luckily I see you every day and I can correct it if I remember the next day. But after he left the room, yatsa u'machzir achareihem, he goes and he chases them down and he says to them, wait, amar lahen, you don't even need that answer. Why? Because shvu'ayim karinan, because everybody reads it as shvu'ayim, and therefore the yesh aim lamikra. He says, and we go by aim lamikra, what everybody reads. And since everybody reads it, is that obviously that's what we go by. So therefore, we see that Rabbi Yehuda ben Roetz also holds by yesh aim lamikra, even says it explicitly. Okay, Beit Shammai, he's the third on the list of Rabbi Yochanan when he said these 5 people all hold yesh aim lamikra. Beit Shammai ditnan, it says in the Mishnah. Beit Shammai omrim, kol hanitanim al mizbach hachitzon shenitanam b'matana achat kiper. Okay, this is any sacrifice brought on the outer altar. There was an altar that's in the sanctuary in the hechal near the menorah and the shulchan, the table where the showbread was. There was also a mizbech there. That's the one of Pnimi. The only sacrifices that we would put the blood on that altar would be for special sacrifices that are chatats. Okay, they're korban chatat. We're going to talk about them later. Like, for example, the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur brings a special korban that goes inside. The blood is sprinkled inside on the altar. And, for example, the par helem davar shel tzibor, that's the bull offering, that if the Sanhedrin teaches something wrong and they made a mistake and people did like their mistake, then they also have to bring this special korban, and that the blood is brought inside. But most of the sacrifices, the blood is brought on the outside, to the outside altar. That's the altar right outside the sanctuary. It's in the Azara, it's called. So any of the korbanot that are brought on the Mizbach HaChitzon, on the outer altar, Beit Shammai says, Shenitana b'matana achat kipel. You're often supposed to put either 2 placings of the blood or 4 placings of the blood on all 4 corners. Sometimes it's 2 that's 4 because you put it on one corner and it goes on both sides. Anyway, there's all sorts of things about the blood, which we're not going to get into right now. We'll get into it more when we get to Masechet Zvachim coming up. Not so soon, but it is coming up. So these things that are brought, b'matana achat kipel. In other words, the whole process of atonement, part of the major process of atonement we're going to learn is the sprinkling of the blood. Now, the sprinkling of the blood, even if you're supposed to do it 4 times or maybe 2 times, but if you did it 1 time, it's effective, meaning you got your atonement even though you didn't do it the ideal manner by doing it 4 times. How do we know this? Shene'emar v'dam zvachecha yishafech. So as long as it's nishpach, okay, the blood of your sacrifices will be spilled. As long as it's spilled once, that should be sufficient. Okay, again, there's the idea and there's what's absolutely necessary. So if you didn't do it 1 time, you're not going to get atonement. But if you did it at least one, you put on one corner of the altar, even if you didn't put in all the places you were supposed to, it's okay. Ubechatan, but that's when it comes to most of the sacrifices brought on the outer altar. However, a regular korban chatat, not the ones brought inside, but a regular korban chatat, shtei matanot, you actually have to do 2. It's not enough to do. You're supposed to do on all 4 corners, but if you did 2, it's sufficient. Beit Hillel thinks even if the chatat was only done on 1 corner, it's enough. The Amar Rav Huna, my time at Beit Shammai. And now comes Rav Huna and he says, what's the reason for Beit Shammai? And he's going to also ask, what's the reason for Beit Hillel? So going back to our chart, now you have to read the Psukim in Vayikra chapter 4, verse 25, verse 30, and verse 34 are all talking about different chatat offerings, sin offerings that were brought. And each one it says almost the same words. Okay, I'm going to read it in one of them. You might see in parentheses, it's a little hard to see with this weird font, but the fonts, I might have mentioned already, but I'll mention it again. When I put psukim in one font, Tanaitic material in a different font, and the Gemara in a 3rd font, because the Gemara is made up of multiple layers, and it's important to see those layers. Sometimes they're quoting psukim, sometimes they're quoting Tanaitic sources. So, and I also changed the colors and the fonts. So this word kranot, okay, right now we're going to see that in our text, it appears without a vav. The Gemara had a text where it appeared with a vav. And this is going to create a little confusion for you, but there's a difference between what the Gemara had a text of the Torah and what we had a text of the Torah, okay? So we'll talk about it in a few minutes. But right now we're going to say we have al kronot mizbach ha'olah, and then again, natan al kronot mizbach ha'olah, and again, natan al kronot mizbach ha'olah. Now, each one is needed for their own section, but theoretically, you don't really need it to mention it each time, because once you mention it in one, the assumption is you do it in the others. So comes Rav Huna and says, Beit Shammai must darshan like this. Beit Shammai is going to say, kronot, 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 hare kan shesh. Really, you have, okay, we're going to do yesh aim lamikra. You read it with vav in all 3 of them, okay, even though the Gemara is going to say that none of the 3 had a vav in it. All were without a vav, which is read as karnat, which is singular. So, Hans Beit Shammai, because we're in Yesh Eim Lamakra, we don't care what it says, it's how it's read. Kronot, 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 all is plural. Everybody reads this as plural. And therefore, you end up with 6 corners. Now, there are no 6 corners on an altar. So why it's 6? Arba mitzvah, 4 is the ideal mitzvah to put on all 4 corners, but shtayim la'akev, but only 2. That's what the extra 2 are for. So only 2 of them are absolutely necessary. If you didn't do those 2, you don't get atonement from this sacrifice. Okay, that's Beit Shammai. Beit Hillel focus on how it appears in the text. Now, look how it appears in the text according to Beit Hillel. Kranot with a vav, kranot without a vav, and kranot without a vav. The first in Pasuk Kafei, it appears with a vav. Now, in our text, it does not appear with a vav, but the Gemara's text had it with a vav, and therefore they said, right, Rav Huna had it with a vav. He said, Harekan arba. So you end up with 4, because kranot with a vav is double. The kranot without a vav is singular, so that's 2 for the first one, and another 2, 1 for each kranot without the vav. You get to 4. Gimel lemitzvah ve'echad la'akev. You have to put on 3 corners just for the purposes of the mitzvah, the extra, or it's ideally. But, meaning really 4 are for the mitzvah, but 3 for the mitzvah, and one of those, right, one in addition to the 3, in other words, 3, okay, you should do it on those 3, but if you don't do it and you only did it on one, you fulfill your obligation. To which the Gemara asks, Ve'ema kulu mitzvah. Why don't you just say there's 4? Maybe 4 means it's all the mitzvah, and you don't actually have to do it at all. Well, no, because kapara bichdi lo eshkechan. There's no such thing as kapara without blood being spilled on the altar. There's no way that it means 4 just la mitzvah, but you don't. Nothing is ma'akev. Nothing prevents you from getting. If you don't do any of them, you still will get atonement. No, that's definitely not possible. Now I just want to stop for 1 minute, okay? But let's review. We have a machloket, yesh em la mikra, yesh em la masoret. Beit Shammai goes by the mikra, by the tradition, which is how you read it. I'm sorry, not by the tradition. I just said that wrong. By the mikra, by the way it's read, which is plural. And therefore we got to 6, which got you to 4, and 2 of those 4 are ma'akev. That 4 plus 2 adds up to 6. Beit Hillel says 1 is malay with the vav. The other 2 are not. So 1 is plural. The other 2 are not. That gets you to 4. And 1 is necessary, and the other 3 are extra. Ideally, you should do them, but to live without them. How do we deal with the fact that the Sefer Torah in front of them had a vav, and we don't have a vav, and they learn this whole halacha from it? Why don't we change our Sefer Torah based on what the Gemara says? So the Rashba says that we don't do that because we don't paskin, very interestingly, we don't hold like the Gemara in terms of their text of the Torah. When it goes to the Torah, we go by the majority of Sefer Torah that we see. And the majority of Sefer Torah that existed then all had no vav there. And therefore they don't have a vav, even though this drasha is based on it having a vav. It's fascinating. We're going to see another case of it later on today. Rabbi Shimon. Now we're up to the next drasha. So Rabbi Shimon says, Shtaim kilchatam, we're talking about sukkah. Okay, how many walls do you need of a sukkah? 2 proper walls. Sorry, shalosh kilchatam, 3 proper walls. And 1 that's only a tefach wide. Okay? Even a tefach wide, as long as it's 10 tefachim tall, that's a good sukkah wall. The 4th one. Okay? So you really need 4 walls, but the 4th one doesn't have to be complete. Sorry. I skipped to Rabbi Shimon by accident. Sorry, let's go back. Ditanya. Shtayim kilchatan v'shlishit afilu tefach. I knew I was getting confused before. Shtayim, 2, okay, we're on the rabbis. We're not on Rabbi Shimon. I got confused because I was looking at my chart at the same time. The rabbis come first here, but they're on the other side of the chart because they hold yesh em la masoret. We'll get there in a minute. 2, kilchatan, you have to have 2 fully proper walls. This is how we hold. And the 3rd one can be 1 tefach wide, as long as it's 10 tefachim high. 1 tefach wide is enough. Rabbi Shimon amar, shalosh kilchatan v'revi'it afilu tefach. So Rabbi Shimon says, no, 3 have to be complete walls, and the 4th can be even a tefach. What's the root of their machloket? Rabbanan savre yesh em la masoret, Rabbi Shimon savre yesh em la mikra. Their machloket is exactly this. How so? Rabbanan savre yesh em la masoret besukot. Okay, now we're going to read besukot teshvu shivat yamim. We're on Vayikra chapter 23, verses 42 to 43. Both those mentions of Sukkot does not have a vav in it. It's chaser, as if it's besukkat, which is singular. Only the 3rd sukkah, besukot, leman yedud overtachem, so that the future generations know, ki besukot hoshav tia b'nei Israel. And their Sukkot appears with a vav. So how many does that give you? Singular, and a double. So again, harekan arba, dal chad kra legufe. 1 is needed to tell you that you have to sit in a sukkah. So we get rid of 1. Pashalu tlak, you're left with 3. And came this tradition, this halacha l'Moshe Sinai, which was passed down for generations that taught us, well, 1 only has to be a tefach. So altogether you have 3. That comes from the besukot. Again, taking off 1 because 1 is necessary to teach you the halacha in general of Sukkot. We're left with 3 references, again, because 1 is plural and the others are singular. So it was 4 minus 1, 3. And comes the halacha l'Moshe Sinai, it says, but that 3rd one doesn't have to be a whole serious wall. Rabbi Shimon saval besukot. If you hold yesh em lamikra, then all of them are plural. Harekan shesh. Okay, now we don't need 6, obviously. Well, dal chad kra legufe. You get rid of 1 because you say we need 1 of them to talk about a sukkah. So we get rid of 1. We're left with 4. Pashalu arba, right? We're left with 4. And then comes the halacha Moshe Sinai and says, well, that last one, the 4th, doesn't need to be a full wall. It can be a tefach. And that's where he gets, though, you do need 4 walls. Okay, and their machloket is based on that. Rabbi Akiva, last one. Tanya, Rabbi Akiva, how do you know that? Now, a body is matame in an oil. You have a dead body in a tent. That body creates impurity in the tent, the whole tent. Not only a body, like a piece of a body that's size of a kazayid, an olive bulk of a piece of a body, even a revi'id of dam, a quarter log of blood, also is matame in an oil. What about revi'id dam that comes from multiple dead bodies? What if you have a quarter log, but it's a combination of more than one body? And it came from different bodies of dead people. Right? We're talking about, right after the person dies, the blood comes out, and we now have a revi'id, but it's made up of two dead people. How do we know that it's matame ba'oel? Shene'emar al kol nafshot met lo yavo shtei nefashot b'shiur echad. It says don't come in contact with nefashot met, and it's plural, bodies of a dead body. What do you learn from there? 2 nefashot and 1 shiur. In other words, don't come in contact with multiple bodies. So from there we learn 1 shiur of revi'id, even if it comes from 2 bodies. But that's how it's read. Notice it's missing a vav. Rabbanan nafshat ktiv. It says it without the vav. And therefore, it's singular, and therefore, revi'id dam would have to be only from 1 body. If it comes from 2 bodies, no. Okay, that's the end of our section, although we're not really done at all because we're going to have a difficulty that's going to raise questions on this entire chart. But what this chart showed was that these 5 machlokot, Rabbi Yehuda ben Roetz, which isn't actually machloket, but Beit Shammai, who disagrees with Beit Hillel, Rabbi Shimon, who disagrees with the rabbis, and Rabbi Akiva, who disagrees with the rabbis, all of them held yesh aim lamikra, and the person on the other side held yesh aim lamasor. But now comes the big stab into this whole theory. Matkef la Rav Acha bar Yaakov. Rav Acha bar Yaakov comes and says, wait a minute, mi kadalela yesh aim lamikra. I'm going to prove to you from a very basic pasuk. Comes Rav Acha bar Yaakov and says, nobody disagrees with this concept of yesh aim lamikra. V'hatanya, doesn't it say in a braita, b'chalev imo lo tavashel gdi b'chalev imo? Don't, what does it mean? Don't cook the meat of a gdi, of a what do you call it, a goat, in its mother's milk. Now, chalev means milk, but yachol b'cheilev, it could be. Cheilev is the forbidden fats. It's the stuff we burn on the altar, and therefore in a regular animal, when you slaughter it, you can't eat it. You might have thought maybe it means cheilev. Amal yesh aim lamikra. Well, the Braita says, from there we learn there's aim lamikra. We go by the way everybody reads the pasuk. Everybody reads the pasuk, right? We all learned it in grade school. You know, you can't cook the meat in the mother's milk, and everybody knows that. So ella de kule alma yesh aim lamikra. Everybody must say yesh aim lamikra. We're now at the top of Amud Bet. Okay, so now what's the problem? If everybody holds, so now Rav Acha bar Yaakov comes to the conclusion, everybody holds yesh aim lamikra. So now we have a problem with this whole chart. We said all these machlokot are based on yesh aim lamikra, yesh aim lamasorah. So now we're going to go to the second sheet, second side of the study guide, also the second side of our daf, where we're going to redo the whole chart and say the machlokot are not based on what we thought. Actually, everybody holds yesh aim lamikra, and we go by the way it's read. In all these cases, it's plural, but their machlokot is going to be based on something else. So we have to go through all our cases. Rabbi v'Rabbanan b'haplige. What's the machlokot between Rabbi and the rabbis? Rabbi savar yarshiun Elohim achrine. When it says yarshiun Elohim, okay, it starts with ad Elohim yavod varshnehem, right? They go to the judge. Asher yashiun Elohim, and then the judge will decide they are convicted. That's a different judge. In other words, there's judges at the top and judges at the bottom. The judges at the bottom, it's plural because we read it as yashiun, and therefore the judges at the top are plural, and we're assuming the judges who are yashiun are not necessarily the same ones as the top ones, and therefore it must mean, in other words, obviously they are all the same ones because in the end they're going to get convicted by that one court. But what it means is there's a reference to 2 different groups of judges, 2 and 2. That gives you 4. 4 from there you get to 5 because you can't have an even number. The Rabbanan Sabra Yershiun Deheach. The rabbis say, no, it's the same judge. Ad Elohim, to the judges, meaning 2 of them, Yavo Divrei Shnehem, Asher Yershiun Elohim. And those 2 judges, which is obviously 2 because Yershiun, because he goes by the way it's read, but those same 2 judges will be the ones who convict him, and then we're left with 2 in the pasuk, but you need a 3rd to make it an odd number, and from there you get to 3. So they both read as Yarshiun in plural, it's just they understand the pasuk differently to get to the 3 or the 5. Rabbi Yehuda ben Roetz, lo pligi Rabbanan alei. Okay, we don't need to explain Rabbi Yehuda ben Roetz because Rabbi Yehuda ben Roetz, if you remember, let's just go back for a second. He had this whole thing about the shvu'ayim and not shiv'im, but nobody disagreed, so it's fine. He says yesh lemikra. We go by the way everybody reads it, and that's 2 weeks and not 70 days. And there's just no one who complains, so we don't have to explain the other side. Let's go to the next machlok. Beit Shammai. Beit Hillel, sorry. How do we explain Beit Hillel? Beit Shammai we know, because he says chronot. There's 6, 4 the mitzvah, 2 la'akev, and that's how we know that you have to do at least 2 matanot for a chatat. Well, they're going to darshan it differently. And first we're going to get a topic sentence, which we're not going to really understand right away. Ditanya. V'chipel mipnei adin. We're going to learn it from these 3 words that appear in the psukim in Vayikra Perek Daled, the 4th chapter. V'chiper, all talking about different chatat offerings, and mipnei hadin, and it's going to be a logical explanation. Okay, we don't yet know what this means. We're going to start from the beginning. V'halo dinhu, and it's just logical to say ne'emar damim lemata. Okay, this is lemata when they would sprinkle the blood on the altar. There was this red line in the center of the height of the altar, and some of the blood would be sprinkled above that, and some of the blood would be sprinkled below. Okay, some was sprinkled on the top part of the altar, and some is sprinkled on the bottom part. So now we're going to say the ones where we sprinkle the blood down below, which is the Ola, Shlamim, and Asham offering, and there's also damim that are sprinkled above, which is the chatat of the animal. So when you bring a sin offering with an animal, v'ne'emar damim lemala. So there's dam, there's blood that's supposed to be sprinkled on the top part, there's dam that's supposed to be sprinkled on the bottom part. Well, the ones that go down below, we know that one is enough. That's what we saw. As long as it gets spilled, we don't care how many times, one is enough. And therefore, there's no reason to distinguish between the chatat as well. It's kind of one and the same. So likewise, when it said you're supposed to put blood on the top part, so if you did one, it would be fine. But this is really said as a question. Oh, kalech l'derech so, or maybe there's a different way to say this. Maybe we say ne'emar damim b'chutz v'ne'emar damim b'fnim. Remember I talked about this blood that gets sprinkled on the inner altar of the chatat hapnimiot, they're called, like the par halim davar shel tzibur and the par of the kohen gadol and Yom Kippur, and there's damim that are done outside. Ma damim, and now there's chatat, there's sin offerings that are those sin offerings we discussed that go on the inside, and there's sin offerings that go on the outside, and outside are the ones we're discussing right now. So maybe you would say there's damim b'chutz and there's damim b'fnim. Ma damim hamurim b'fnim chiser achat mimatanot la'asav l'klum. Now the ones that go on the inner altar, you might think, right? The ones that go on the inner altar, it's known that you have to do it on all 4 corners. If you don't, you didn't fulfill your mitzvah. So af damim, you might say also maybe then the ones that are done b'chutz, af damim hamurim b'chutz chiser achat mimatanot la'asav klum. If you didn't do one of them, maybe you didn't do anything. So now, right, if you miss one, you have to do all 4. So now the big question in this Braita is, do we learn damim from the other korbanot that are done in the outer altar, even though they're not sin offerings, or do we learn it from the sin offerings that are done on the inner altar? If we learn from the outer, well then, one is enough. If we learn from the inner, then you have to do them all. Near elemi domet. So his question is going to continue. Do we say danim? We're going to see to which is it more similar. Do we danim chutz michutz ve'in danim chutz mipnim? Do we learn everything on the outer altar from everything that's done on the outer altar, and we don't learn from something done on the inner altar? Or maybe we go the other way and we say danim chatat arba kranot mechatat arba kranot, and maybe we say chatat and 4 corners, right? The one that done on the inner altar is done. It's a sin offering, and it's done on all 4 corners. Likewise, the one on the outside for the sin offering is a sin offering, and it's done on all 4 corners. So maybe we should learn from there. And then, again, we're going to get to the conclusion that you need all of them. Talmud Lomau. So now they're going to say, that's why the Torah repeated by each different individual kind of korban chatat. By each one, it said, v'chipel, 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 mipnei adin. Okay, now what does it mean, mipnei adin? So they're going to say, logic would state like this. Kipel afal pi shelo natan el shlosha. Kipel afal pi shelo natan el shtayim. Kipel afal pi shelo natan el echad. Each subsequent word of the kiper is coming to say You're going to get atonement even if you skip a time. You're going to get atonement even if you skip another time. You're going to get atonement even if you skip a third time, meaning all you need is one. And that's the Mipnei Adin that he was mentioning at the beginning that we learned from V'chiper, V'chiper, V'chiper. So now we finally go back and explain that topic sentence. And from there, that's how, right? So you fulfill your obligation. And that's the reason for Beit Hillel. It's a drasha, V'chiper, V'chiper, V'chiper. It has nothing to do with yesh la masolet. Now we're going to go to Rabbi Shimon. We still have two more left to explain. Rabbi Shimon, v'Rabbanan b'haplige, in the Sukkah case. Rabbi Shimon savar schacha lo ba'ikra. Rabbi Shimon says, in the end, we're going to remember, he got rid of one pasuk because we needed to teach about Sukkah, but we don't need anything more than that. We don't need a pasuk to teach about schach. It's obvious a Sukkah has schach. You don't need another pasuk to teach you about the covering of the Sukkah. So therefore, again, let's just go back. If that's the case, we have besukot, 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 that's 6. We got rid of one pasuk, which gets rid of 2. We're left with 4. And that means 4 walls of a sukkah. Comes the halach l'Moshe b'Sinai and drops it down to the fourth one only needs a tefach. And that's because he holds you don't need a pasuk for the schach. But the rabbis say you need a pasuk for the schach. The Rabbanan savrei schacha ba'ikra. You get rid of one of the besukot because, right, you start off besukot, besukot, besukot. You have 6 because, right, you already... Everything is, remember, everybody holds yesh la mikra, the way it's read. It's all read plural, so that's 6. Then we take away, now the Gemara doesn't tell you this, but we take away one pasuk because you need it for the sukkah, and that gets rid of 2. You take away another pasuk, it gets rid of the schach. Now the problem is a little tricky here. You're really only taking away one of the 4. In other words, you're left with 4. We say that kind of half of one of the sukkot is for the schach. So now you're left with 3 walls, comes the halach l'Moshe b'Sinai and drops the 3rd wall to a tefach. Rabbanan b'hapligi. Rabbi Akiva Rabbanan b'hapligi. Last machloket, the nifashot. Al kol nafshot meit lo yavo. It doesn't have a vav, but who cares? Because everyone's going to read it as if it has a vav. So, how are we going to get this distinction? Rabbi Akiva is obvious. Nifashot, we say, means 2. So it can come from 2 bodies. So Rabbi Akiva, nifashot tarte mashma, means 2. For Rabbanan Savrei nifashot de alma mashma. The nifashot is referring to, when it says I'll call nifashot meit lo yavo, it means not this one and not next week when you have another one and not the one after that. It doesn't mean 2 at the same time and the blood from 2. So therefore, he just has a different way of darshaning that pasuk. Okay, so we got through all of our drashot, and we now explain them all in a different way, but everyone can hold yesh la mikra. And that whole thing was raised because Rav Acha bar Yaakov came and said, what about this lo tvashal di b'chalev imo? We read as chalev, as milk, and not cheilev, as the cheilev, the forbidden fats. So he had to say everyone holds yesh la mikra, and reread all those machlokot. Well, it's going to get even more confusing because now the Gemara is going to say, Udekule alma yesh la mikra. Wait a minute, not everybody holds yesh la mikra. And with this, we're going to reject what Rav Acha said. Because Hatanya, litotafot, here we're getting to tefillin. And here again, we're going to have a problem because litotafot by us in the first reference, okay, which is Shmot Yud Gimel Tet Zayin, you can look at it inside, has a vav. In our Gemara, it doesn't have a vav. First one doesn't have a vav. The second one, Dvarim Vav, chapter 6, verse 8, doesn't have a vav. And in Dvarim 11, verse 18, it has a vav. So you're going to get to 4 because totafot, both are singular, and the second one is plural. So litotafot, harekan arba, divrei Rabbi Yishmael. Now, what do you say? If he says arba, it means yesh la masoret, and there already you have your problem. Rabbi Akiva Omer, no tzarich. Rabbi Akiva obviously holds yesh la mikra. We already saw that. It's the way it's read. But we don't even need to learn it from there because he learns it a different way. It's a bit of a strange drasha. Rabbi Akiva here, tat bekatve shtayim, tat ba'afriki shtayim. If you wonder, it's a weird word, litotafot. Well, he says it comes from foreign languages. Tat in katve, which was a language that people spoke around then, was 2. And in Afriki, sounds like Afrikaans, but I assume it wasn't really that. But it's another language. Pat means 2 in another language. And that's how we get to 4. This is all, we didn't really say what we were talking about. We're obviously talking about the 4 boxes of the tefillin. So there's 4 boxes of the tefillin. From there, we learn that from either litotafot, and that's based on yesh la masoret, versus Rabbi Kiva, who learns it somewhere else. And therefore, elalo lam pligi, for sure they argue about yesh em lamikra, yesh em lamasoret. So now we're back to square one. But the problem with square one is we had a problem. What about the chalav and cheilev? So, hani mile, well, we have a machloket when? Ki pligi hechadishani krami masoret. It's when it's written differently. We had nafshot with a vav, nafshot without a vav. We had kranot with a vav, kranot without a vav. Cheilev and chalav, or chalev, in that pasuk, is the same letters. It's just different vowels. That's a different story. When it's different letters, we can have a machloket. If there is a vav or there isn't a vav, we can darshan that. And some can say we care that it doesn't have a vav, and some can say we don't care. But when it's aval haich cheilev or chalav v'cheilev d'chiyadadininu, they look exactly the same. In that case, we're always going to follow yesh em lamikra. So that's why nobody disagrees in the chalav case. It's obviously milk, and nobody thinks otherwise. To which the Gemara says, wait a minute, that's your answer to the question that Rav Acha raised? Well, we have a problem with that because, and with that, you're going to reject what we just said when you're going to say, really, yesh em lamikra and em lamasoret is a machloket, and chalav and cheilev is different because it's written the same, and you never have a machloket in that case. But we do have people who say yesh em lamasoret even in a case where it's the exact same letters. Where is that? Hare yir'eh yira'eh. Okay, it says in the pasuk, Shalosh pamim b'shana, yera'eh kol zakurcha, right? Everyone will appear before God. Well, comes Rabbi, sorry, let me just find it inside. Okay. Now that, whether you say it's spelled, right, it's written, you would normally read that word as yir'eh, but we read it as yera'eh. So they're hadadininu. It's the exact same letters, no letters changed. It's just two different readings, upligi. And there's clearly a machloket about that. How do we know? Tanya, it says in a Braita, Yochanan ben Dahavai umil mishum Rabbi Yehuda ben Tema, hasuma be'echad me'inav patur min ha're'iyah. If you're blind in one eye, you're exempt from going to the temple. Why is that? Shneimar yir'eh yira'eh kiderech sheba li'ra'ot kach ba le'ra'ot. The same way you go to be seen, the same way you go and you see with two eyes, that's how you go to be seen with two eyes. So, ma le'ra'ot b'shtei einav, af le'ra'ot b'shtei einav. So just like when you see with both eyes. When you go to be seen, you go to be seen if you have both eyes. But if you're blind in one eye, you're actually exempt. So what do you see here? This drasha is based on two different readings, which would mean goes by the masoret. How it's written, we also read it as yir'eh. You'll see just like you are seen. Okay? That takes into account the masoret, how it's written, and not only how it's read. So from there we see, even when it's the same letters, we also have a machloket. So we're stuck with this chalev imo. How do we know it's milk and not forbidden fats? So Ela Amar Rav Acha bered Rav Ika, a different Rav Acha answers the question that the original Rav Acha asked and says, Amar Kra lo tivashel gedi derech bishul asra Torah. Lo tivashel is to cook. Now, we call cooking everything these days, but in those days, cooking meant with liquid. Even nowadays, maybe it does mean with liquid, but in those days, for sure, it meant with liquid. And fat is not really liquid. It's true it turns liquidy, but it's not really. It's very thick. Must be lo tivashel, must be referring to cooking, and cooking must be with milk. And therefore, in the end, to conclude, there is a machloket. So we can go back and reinstate this first chart that we saw today. Yesh em lamikra, yesh em lamasoret. We can hold by Rabbi Yochanan, who said that's the division between all these opinions, and right, these five opinions all hold yesh em lamikra against those who hold yesh em lamasoret. But lo tevashel gedi is an exception to the rule. There, nobody thinks we go by the way it's written, that it could be written as cheilev, because it's bishul, and because it's cooking, it's obvious that it means milk and not something that's much thicker. And with that, we finished our daf. So we had two different approaches to understanding all these machlokot, right? And the second one wasn't, they weren't all based on the same thing. Each one you had to explain in a different way, because we then said everybody holds yesh em lamikra, and that we go by the way it's read and not by the way whether it has a yud or doesn't have a yud. But in the end, we reject this whole reading and we go back and reinstate the original reading and say that really there is a machloket in any case for yesh emlam, kra yesh emlam masoret, even if the word looks the same, still like yireh and yera'eh, just lo tavashel gdi is an exception to the rule. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and a Shavua Tov.